that the only people that link food and nuclear weapons is not the United States, it's North Korea. It's not the U.S. And that from the U.S. perspective, it is still humanitarian. Having said that, when the North announced this missile or satellite launch, and the United States said, well, we're not giving food anymore, it kind of made clear that the two were linked in our minds. So I think that's a tough situation to be in. And perhaps it's all moot because there isn't going to be any agreement anymore. But I would agree that there was a crossing of a line there that was not as explicit in the past.
I'd like to add to that. You have to look at what is the purpose of food aid. If the purpose of food aid is to bribe the North Koreans on a nuclear or political arrangements, that is not really what is intended by food aid. Food aid is supposed to reach hungry people, and there are a lot of hungry people in North Korea. And the whole idea is to make a distinction between the government and the population. The population, we cannot hold the government responsible, the population responsible for what the government does. We have to try to reach that population with food, because all the reports show, a tremendously difficult situation in North Korea. It's not like the famine of the 1990s. There are various estimates of how many hundreds of thousands of million died. But there are pockets of tremendous malnutrition. There have been people who are starving, and perhaps starving to death in some places in the north. The children, the population is stunted. You can meet North Koreans and see how thin they are, and what the the health consequences for not having enough food. We often talk about North Korea as if there's supposed to be some great famine there, like in an African country like Somalia. But the whole purpose of food aid is to avert a famine. It's not to wait till there's that kind of starvation to go on. And the purpose is really to save lives. This is a humanitarian imperative. So essentially, by linking this to nuclear weapons and saying the purpose of food aid to North Korea is different than to other countries. The purpose is to serve political ends. That basically then forgets the population in that country and their terrible food needs and their health needs. So we just put that aside. The statistics are very bad on children in North Korea. They're the most vulnerable to this lack of food. Now, the other part of it is that if you play on that playing field of linking the two, then if the nuclear arrangements don't go well, as we just have seen, then there's no food aid. So we forget the whole population. If, on the other hand, and Andrew Natsios pointed this out, if the nuclear agreements do go well, say there were good political nuclear discussions, then if the food aid is not being monitored, or the North Koreans are not fulfilling their agreements to allow monitoring of the food aid the way the agreement would have been, so that it reaches the needy, there's going to be no effort to want to say anything about that in order not to upset the political nuclear agreements. So either in all these ways, the whole humanitarian food aid issue has been subjugated to political objectives, and I think it's a terrible mistake, and not just in the case of North Korea, but it's a signal internationally. The United States is the world's largest single food donor, and this says quite a lot, that food then is totally politically, within a political context, and that's how it's delivered. And we have made such a big deal about monitoring that was the main issue. And we managed to negotiate quite strong agreement with them, North Koreans, about monitoring. But that is just dropped because of political issues. So this playing field is very hard if you're going to link them one goes together with the other, and I think it's a bad model for food aid for the rest of the world and as a standard. It's not what the standards are, the good donorship principles, they call them, that the U.S. has agreed to and how you deliberate and on what grounds and conditions.
Just real quickly on the microfinance, I agree with Dr. Cha that it's very basic. The little that exists is very basic, so it's a lot of more educational training, economic training. There are some activities in the border from China to North Korea, so there are people, entities, and enterprises that are set up to specifically train these North Korean merchants that cross the border to do educational training on, pricing, business ownership, accounting, Soviet Union collapse, history classes. And I don't know if you've heard of a group called Chosun Exchange, but around them is a group of venture capitalists, young venture capitalists in the U.S., Harvard business grads, these bright minds of business, who are kind of hovering around them, doing these regular calls to see if there are areas of that venture capitalists can be of help to North Korea's economic development. So I think it's a new area, and people are kind of talking about it.
My name is Sarah Lee. I'm a sophomore in Foreign Service at Georgetown. And Dr. Cha mentioned about raising awareness about human rights issues in North Korea. And I've been following up several articles that interviewed the North Koreans in the border area in China. And they were saying how severe reactions from South Korea, like media reports and politicians protesting, and from Chinese embassy. Those things are actually making their lives harder if they're sent back to North Korea, because they're being expected with harsher punishments. Because once the defecting issue gets related to South Korea, it becomes a very political issue that's very sensitive. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, whether just raising awareness is the most effective way to deal with these issues, considering what some of the North Koreans think about the whole spotlight on the issue.
Yeah. And it's a good question. I think there are always trade-offs when you talk about these things. There's some who believe that the better path is much more of a quiet, case-by-case path, rather than sort of pushing a broader movement. I just don't. I don't know. I think awareness is important. Again, I'm struck by how little the general public really understands or cares about these issues. So I've tried to think of all sorts of crazy ways to try to create broader interest in this. And I don't know if I'd say some of them on camera, but there are some ideas. But I think that's just a very important part of it. And I would agree with you that one of the sources of this sort of consciousness raising in the past has always been folks who've left the country. But in the case of North Korea, we don't. That group is not as politically active and motivated as other groups. In previous cases, who left the country. But it seems to me that that's a very important part of this. If we're going to make it a part of a policy agenda, if we want countries to actually push these issues, I don't think you're going to be able to push it by reducing awareness. I think you have to increase it.
I'd like to follow up on another very interesting point that Professor Cha has made, that we do not have a North Korean human rights ambassador in Hollywood. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, we haven't really had a true Hollywood production on North Korea. The closest it ever came was Crossing, a very good, very well-made South Korean movie, extraordinary, but nevertheless a Korean movie. There is, of course, the lack of visual images. We have the visual images from Darfur, from South Sudan, and the response is instantaneous. Due to the very tight control of information in North Korea, we do not have these visual images. Then there is the other issue of perception, as Victor has pointed out. President George W. Bush was genuinely dedicated to these issues. You have board members who had traveled to North Korea, came back, and were telling us stories about him taking them aside, being almost in tears. He cared deeply about North Koreans, brought Kim Il-sung to the White House, the author of The Aquariums of Pyongyang. And for that reason, there is somehow this strange perception that Tibet and Darfur are liberal issues, or tilted towards the liberal side, while North Korean human rights is a conservative issue. That is not the case at all, and our committee is the best proof that that is not the case at all. We're very bipartisan. Then there are, of course, other issues that we have mentioned. There are always a lot of international priorities, very important issues, the Middle East, Iran, Syria. It's always hard to get North Korea at the top of the list unless the North Koreans pursue some brazen military provocation and missile launch and nuclear experiment. Even when they do get to the top of the agenda, these very important issues, it's once again a challenge to keep human rights on a par with other very important issues. Going back to the defectors, those individual cases are very important, but this relatively small group of dedicated human rights advocates are also their best friends. And yeah, the argument has been made that the UNHCR should be more proactive. The UNHCR is a great ally of the international human rights community in China in particular, doing a lot of great work. So these are the very outfits and the very individuals who are dedicated to this cause of human rights in North Korea. We need to build on their efforts to definitely expand awareness.
Let me add too that 23,000 North Koreans are now in South Korea. Hundreds of them were in these prison camps, and they're telling their stories. So you're not going to have silence. You will have more and more awareness as more and more testimonies come out. There's a new book that's just now published called Escape from Camp 14. And you'll see it being advertised and written about. And it's the story of a particular prisoner. But there are other stories. The Committee for Human Rights in North Korea is coming out in another week or two with a report, an update on hidden gulag, with many testimonies from prisoners. Greg Scarlatoiu has organized a big conference on this subject with former prisoners. So, you know, you can argue that this awareness raising and these people telling their stories and publishing it, well, maybe China will crack down a bit because they're threatened by the information of forcibly returning people. But I don't think silence generally helps anyone. And I think that it's important to have the information come out. This is just information. And it's coming out more and more, and should.
So, I mean, we're supposed to include, like, are you guys willing to take more questions? One or two more questions? Okay. Why don't we take someone in the back?